Hello everyone, I hope you're doing fantastic today. My name is Emily and today I will be recommending you 10 witchy reads. It's that time of year again, the veil is thin, it's that creepy fall atmosphere. It is the season of the witch. So today I thought I would recommend you 10 witchy books. So we're talking books with witches, of course. We're also talking books with very interesting connections to nature and the mystical aspect of nature. We're also looking at generally really interesting and elegant portrayals of magic. Maybe there are generational stories of women with supernatural powers. In any case, if you're looking for a witchy read and you're hoping to get into the spirit of the season, I hope you'll find something on this list. So let's get right to it. Let's talk about some books. The first book I want to recommend is actually a series of books, and that's The Raven Cycle by Maggie Stiefvater. The main character is a girl called Blue Sargent who grows up in a family of witchy women. She has been warned all her life that she will cause her true love to die. And one day she meets a group of boys from the local prep school and she is drawn into their lives and their shenanigans. And that causes her to worry because she suspects that one of them is actually her true love. So I really loved this series, not least because of the great characters and the romantic angst. But I also loved the nature of the magic in the story. I loved how mysterious it was and how tied to nature it was. I loved how homespun and simple the magic could be, just as simple as one of Blue's aunts scrying in a bowl. But at other times it was really trippy, like when people go into dreams and shape them and pull things out of dreams. And of course I loved the witchy group of women that Blue lives with her mom. They were all such characters. They each had their own way of doing magic and their own approaches to it. I love the vibe of these women who have their own spiritual business and read tarot for people, but at the same time they are harboring these really amazing powers. And when I look back at this series, that is what I remember the most, the really witchy, mysterious vibes. So if you want a really witchy book with a lot of romantic angst, I highly recommend The Raven Cycle. Next up, I want to recommend A Discovery of Witches. Now, I know a lot of people have really mixed opinions about this book. And for people who don't like this book, I don't blame them at all. I mean, this book, it's an interesting case. So how I would describe this book is that it's basically Twilight, but witchy, and with some dark academia vibes. Our main character is Diana Bishop, and she is an academic from Yale who is taking a research sabbatical at Oxford. While she's in Oxford's very famous Bodleian Library, she finds a very mysterious, seemingly magical manuscript, which kind of frightens her. She returns the manuscript, but when the local supernatural creatures in the area, like all the vampires and the witches and the demons, all find out that she's accessed it, they all want to access it themselves, so they all try and get close to her. One of these creatures is a vampire who is also working at Oxford, and they fall in love, and he eventually takes it on himself to protect her. So like I said, this book is basically Twilight but dark academia. I personally went into this book with quite low expectations, which could account for my enjoyment of this book. I didn't enjoy all of it, mind you. I mean, there was all kinds of issues I had with Diana's slowly dwindling agency. Her vampire boyfriend eventually takes control of her entire life, basically. And oh my god, there was so much horse riding. When I finished this book, I was like, if I never read about another horse ride again, I will be happy. But I really liked the atmosphere of this book. I really was interested in the world and all the creatures and how they work and cooperate with each other. And throughout this book, we have Diana coming into her own power as a witch, and her aunts, who are also witches, are very useful in that respect. And I loved going to their witchy cottage in America and having those vibes as well. So if you're looking for a romance that's kind of witchy and is not very deep, I highly recommend A Discovery of Witches. And also there's a show, and the new season is coming out soon apparently. Next up, I want to recommend Uprooted by Naomi Novik. This book is about a girl called Agnieszka. She lives in an unspecified Slavic country. Her village is beholden to a wizard called the Dragon, and every decade or so the dragon comes and picks up a girl of his choosing, and she goes to live with him for a few years or so. One day the dragon comes and picks her, to everybody's surprise. It turns out that Agnieszka has magical powers of her own, and that's why the dragon has selected her, so he can train her. Meanwhile, there is the problem of this mysterious forest that seems to encroach on the local humans and seems to consume people who approach it. This was a really beautiful read. I loved the Lovecraftian nature of the forest and how dangerous it is. I always love nature magic in these books. I also really loved the incorporation of Slavic tales and folklore into the story. The nature of the magic and the magic system could have been tightened up a bit. I didn't think it was perfect, but I really did love the fairy tale vibes of this story. I really loved seeing Agnieszka connect with nature and being able to really investigate what was going on with this dangerous forest. A witchy book if I ever read one. My next recommendation is The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. This is another very fairy tale-like read. It takes place in medieval Russia. The main character is a girl called Vasya who grows up in a Russian village, and she can commune with a lot of the local spirits. But one day her father brings home a very heavily Christian and very paranoid stepmother, and she does not take kindly to Vasya's abilities or her predilections for nature. So that makes Vasya's life kind of difficult, and meanwhile there are mysterious forces from the forest that are threatening the village. So Vasya has to tap into her gifts, which she inherited from her dead mother, and use them to protect her hometown. I loved the fairy tale atmosphere of this book, and the writing is beautiful and lyrical. I loved the mysterious and mystical atmosphere of the forest that is inhabited by all these different spirits. I love the depiction of the conflict between old and new spiritualities and the conflict of beliefs. And I loved Vasya. I think she is the embodiment of the wild woman. She is really at home in nature, but she's also forced to conform to familial expectations and to the traditional gender roles of the time. And eventually she faces superstition for her abilities and powers, and I think any witch, even now, can relate to that issue. The next read is a little bit more lighthearted. It's The We Free Men by Terry Pratchett. So this is part of Terry Pratchett's Discworld, and it's the first of the Tiffany Aching series of books in that universe. This is about a young girl called Tiffany, of course, and she is a witch-to-be, and she's quite young. I think she's 12 in this book. One day, Tiffany's brother is kidnapped by the fairies, so she has to team up with a set of rambunctious Pixies. They're basically a set of little folk who look like Scottish Picts. She enlists their help to go into fairyland and get her brother back. So this book was really funny and really charming and pretty quintessentially Terry Pratchett. And Tiffany is a really great character. She is very down to earth, and of course the We Free Men are really awesome and very entertaining. So if you want a really fantastic young adult witchy read, I highly recommend this one. In the vein of Terry Pratchett, I want to recommend Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. Of course, a couple of years ago, this was made into a mini-series on Amazon Prime. In this book, the forces of heaven and hell want to bring about the apocalypse, but several things have gone awry, namely, the Antichrist is missing. The main characters are Crowley and Aziraphale, who are an angel and demon who have become friends over the past millennia. They've also become quite attached to humanity, so they've decided that maybe the apocalypse isn't so great after all. And a witch heavily features in this book, and she is in the possession possession of a book of prophecies from a long, long dead ancestor. And she has to work through that book of prophecies to foresee what's actually going to happen and how things will turn out. Of course, this was a very comical read, like any book written with Terry Pratchett is, and of course Neil Gaiman brought in his really classic horror vibes. If you did watch the miniseries and you liked it and you haven't read this book, I do highly recommend it. Next, I'm going to recommend The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I don't even know where to start with this book. This is probably one of my favorite fantasy books ever. And of course, this is my beautiful Waterstones edition of this book. So this is a historical fantasy that surrounds a circus called the Cirque du Rêve. It is a traveling circus that boasts many amazing acts and sights. And at the center of the circus are two magicians, Celia and Marco. They have been pitted against each other in a magical competition since they were kids by their masters. But eventually these two fall in love, which causes all kinds of complications. So the magicians in this book are not explicitly named as witches, but I really loved the depiction of magic in this book. I think this was one of the most elegant depictions of magic I had seen. There's a scene I really love in this book of two characters almost communicating with each other through their displays of magic and kind of having it be an ongoing exchange. It was just really wonderful. And like all of Erin Morgenstern's writing, this was very dreamlike. I really loved soft magic systems for a reason. It allows for that kind of mystical atmosphere that you don't really get with a lot of harder systems. I honestly can't say enough good things about this book. It's just a beautiful ride. Next on my list is A Secret History of Witches by Louisa Morgan. This is a book I literally finished last week. This is a multi-generational story of a family of Romani witches as they flee persecution in France and end up in the UK. And through every generation, they have to deal with issues of persecution, alienation, coming into your individual powers and passing it on to the next generation. I did have my own issues with this book, but I won't really delve into them in this video. If you're looking for a family narrative about women dealing with issues of their own power and inheritance, this is a great book. Each generation comes with different issues depending on the historical atmosphere and how things have changed with the times. I've heard people complain that they didn't really understand how the magic worked in this book. It just seemed to do things and not be explained all the way, and I think that's kind of the point. If anything, it jives with my experience of how magic works in real life, in my own practice as a witch. Sometimes you work a bit of magic and it manifests in really unexpected ways, and ultimately this is a great story about feminine power. So in the vein of inherited female power, the next book I want to recommend is The Twisted Tree by Rachel Burge. The main character of this book is a girl called Martha who has an accident one day when she falls from a tree and she is blinded in one eye. However, when she receives this injury, she also acquires a new ability where she can sense people's thoughts and feelings through their clothing. She doesn't know how to deal with this ability, so she travels to her grandmother in Norway to get some answers. Unfortunately, her grandmother is already dead and there is a mysterious goth boy living in her grandmother's cottage. And also there are dangerous mythical creatures threatening to kill everyone in the local village. So why am I recommending this as a witchy book? I think this is a great story about accepting your own abilities and coming to peace with your family legacy. I think it's a great story about women with supernatural abilities, families of women with these abilities, and passing them on to future generations. And also the magic in the story is very mythic in nature. There's a lot of Norse myths featured in this book. And eventually we do have an encounter with an actual Norse goddess, which is so amazing, and it was so moving when I read it. I think this is one of the most underrated young adult books I read last year. I have been recommending it to everybody. I think everybody who's into magic and magical women and Norse myths should read this book. And finally, I want to recommend Practical Magic by Alice Hoffman. You might know it from the film adaptation with Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman, which was made in the 90s. Controversial opinion, I really didn't like the film. I thought it changed the book and deviated from it in a lot of really unnecessary ways, and I just didn't like the way they deviated. I didn't like how rom-com it was, and I didn't like how they took away a lot of the mysticism of the magic. It was also really tonally weird. Like, it was kind of a comedy, but also trying to show really horrifying magic at the same time. But basically, this book is about two sisters called Sally and Jillian, and they grow up with their witchy aunts. The novel follows them through their individual lives and the different paths that they take, and eventually they have to come back together again because of various circumstances in their lives. The story also shows how they each individually come to terms with their own magic and their own powers, and how they have to unite with their family in order to solve some really big issues. The way Alice Hoffman writes is so beautiful. I love how she describes magic. I love how she describes little slices of life with the aunts and with each of the two sisters. I don't know how she does it, but these sisters go through these really soap opera issues, but the way Alice Hoffman writes it, she makes it out to be so literary and mysterious and magical. If you do read one witchy book this season, I highly recommend Practical Magic. It is a classic and you cannot go wrong with it. And if you're choosing between the film and the book, I highly recommend the book over the film. So that's it for my witchy book recommendations. I hope you found something that you wanted to read this season to get into the vibe of this season. If I didn't name your favorite witchy book, maybe I didn't like it when I read it, but chances are I just haven't read it. So comment down below if there is a witchy book that you really love and want to recommend. In the meantime, like this video if you liked it and subscribe to my channel. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram and Goodreads, and I will see you in my next video.